Hi everybody, Doc Horowitz here, and in wanting to provide you with some information about this upcoming module, I want to refer back to the introductory piece in which you saw a graphic, cartoonish type demonstration of a group of employees gathering around a 8 o'clock meeting, at which I think 4 or 5 out of 6 of the participants really didn't like the 8 o'clock meeting. And it was entitled, "Who Invented the 8 o'clock Meeting?" Well, I can tell you it wasn't me, because like one of the participants, I'm not a morning person. And I'm also one of the expressive or creative communication style types. So people like us as a category, a culture, generally aren't conscious, if you will, early in the morning or very creative. So this presents us with a pretty good overview opportunity for this whole issue of what do you do as a leader, as a colleague, family member, friend, when you encounter situations that, for lack of a better term, we call conflict. A lot of our course has dealt with, of course, communication in itself, but a unique emphasis has been on the cultural aspect, meaning the differences that individuals bring with them to the workplace and pretty much anywhere else they go. And we've had a lot of activities and discussions related to our own cultural programming in which we discovered some of our own values, values that we hold very dearly for the most part, and where they actually came from in our backgrounds. So now we're left with the whole issue, now as we are actually engaged in the workplace, what to do when we encounter individuals, particularly as leaders, who not only have differences, but they have differences in their values and ways of working that may actually compete with other workers and in fact create some friction, tension, and the point being that, as you've probably experienced, when you engage or encounter conflict over differences in how to work or the environment, this can lead to problems in terms of conflict. And if left without some interaction, most of us have encountered the impact of that kind of a situation. That impact being lack of engagement, low morality, lateness, absenteeism, certainly a lack of maximizing the productivity of everyone in your organization. So with that introduction of the cartoon, if you will, and I chose that very specifically because it demonstrates difference that revolves around an issue of individual differences, and that's just fine. It's also a little bit more low-key. The approach that we're going to examine now is called the interest-based approach, or IBA for short, as a search for solution to these competing differences, particularly that arise in the workplace. Now, these can be used in very difficult situations. Cultural values, as you know, can invite a lot of disharmony. They can be based on everything from racism to religious differences to political differences and so forth. And these differences can, in fact, be very, very destructive to an organization. So the research behind this new approach, IBA, came out of Harvard University, and it was mostly based on a group of people who did work that was called Getting to Yes. What makes this process so different from traditional ways of resolving conflict is the emphasis on reaching what we call mutually agreed upon solutions. Traditionally, when there was conflict, either between labor and management or leaders and employees, the conflicts tended to be adversarial. Everyone spoke about their problem from their position, if you will, and it became kind of a tug of war, and the person with the most power or the leader simply arbitrarily gave a solution in what they thought would be in the best interest of everyone. IBA works quite differently. IBA is more or less a voluntary process in which people coming together who are stakeholders in a particular issue recognize that they are in fact required to search for what we again call mutually agreed upon solutions. So even the language is rather positive, because in traditional conflict resolution strategies, they're basically either win or lose or compromise, and a compromise by definition means everybody had to give up something. IBA is different. In IBA, we look at people and their values and what we call fundamental interests, and it's based on the idea that if we can identify individuals and their fundamental interests to a particular issue, and we can accommodate or satisfy their belief about that value, then we are likely to find people accepting of solutions based upon their having their fundamental issue accommodated or attended to. So how does this process actually work? I can tell you it's not an easy process, because unlike the 8 o'clock meeting, when we start to discuss people's deeply seated issues around religion and race and politics, it is very difficult for people to step out of that box, if you will, and look at the issue from another point of view. And yet that's exactly what we are required to do using the interest-based approach, or IBA method. So how does it work? Well, first thing is you got to identify an issue. How do you end up doing that? Well, issues come to the attention of employees and leaders in particular in lots of ways. Some of them are formal, such as having a survey, asking employees to identify what some of the problems are, if you will, that are going on that may be impacting and keeping them from maximizing their productivity. Sometimes individual employees will come to a leader or a manager and present a problem in which the leader will then have to think about how to solve this problem. Not just from the point of view of the person bringing the issue to him or her, but to the overall organization as well. We can recall our discussion on systems theory and recognize that it isn't enough to simply solve one problem somewhere in one part of the organization, because anything we do to one part of an organization or a system has an impact on perhaps every other part of that system. And we want to keep that system in harmony, in balance, and therefore conflict from a systems theory perspective can be viewed as a situation in the environment that is unbalancing the system and is in need of a remedy that will bring it back into harmony again. So let's return to how do we do this. We just discovered pretty typically how you find out that you've got a problem. The other thing is you look around, and particularly the leader will do that, and realize that meetings aren't productive, or workers aren't interacting or engaging with one another in a positive manner. As I said earlier, there may be higher absenteeism, the quality of the product may be affected, and the list goes on and on. So, with IBA, we really break down the process into 3 different parts. First, with the acceptance that people want to, in fact, represent a group at an IBA session. There may be many people have similar feelings. You may have 25, 30, 50 employees, and you may have 1 or 2 who may represent others. Therefore, it's unrealistic to expect you'll have 50 people attending a session of IBA. But you can have representatives of everyone in the unit who has a stake in that particular issue. So what do? Well, they come together. And it's pretty informal in that sense. There are no written notes of the meeting. There is simply the meeting and an agreement that each member will abide by certain guidelines during the session and search for a mutually agreed upon solution. So step one in the process is simply tell your story. And with that, we have every individual represented at the conference or session tell from their point of view what the problem is. We saw it in our little cartoon. We had Mary, who has a kid who's got to have daycare, so she's got to drop the child off and she has to rush to the meeting and she's all frazzled when she gets there. Well, that doesn't work well in terms of getting the most input out of someone like Mary. But Mary tells her story, and that's her story. So others, as we saw represented in the caricature, also told their story about either not being morning people, like myself, or being morning people and just liking the meeting fine. Others who get bored by the meeting because they're not stimulating enough, and the list again goes on and on. So everybody goes around and tells their story. And there are no comments about it in terms of disagreeing. The story is owned by the person telling it. And from their vantage point, it is true. Once the story of each individual has been noted, usually on a blackboard of some type, by a facilitator, and we'll talk more about the role of the facilitator, it's vital. The group then goes on to investigate and reveal their fundamental interest in that particular issue. Let's go back to Mary just for a moment. Her story, if you recall, is that she's got to drop her child off, and it leaves her very little time to get to the meeting on time, to get settled and make a meaningful contribution. But that isn't Mary's fundamental interest. That's a story, and that story can change every day. Mary's fundamental issue is, and many of you have guessed it, her child. Whatever affects her child will become a fundamental concern to Mary. This comes into play later on, perhaps, where you know that you're going to have a volunteer charity car wash on a Saturday. Well, when you're trying to get Mary to volunteer for something, always remember that maybe the number one fundamental interest of Mary is her child. So this is what separates the storytelling from a fundamental interest. One is the specific issue you're dealing with at the time. The other is a fundamental value that people hold dearly and must be accommodated. So the idea is that through this dialogue of IBA, if all participants can offer options that would in fact address Mary's issue of her child, then Mary is likely to be more accepting of an option about how to deal with the meeting, as long as her fundamental interest is accommodated. So that takes quite a bit of time as well. And this is probably the best time to bring up the role, and it's the most vital, of that of the facilitator. The facilitator, while he or she can be a member of your team, your staff, your unit, department, can also be an outside observer or a specialist. That many organizations hire consultants to come in and actually conduct these interest-based approach meetings. What's vital here is that that facilitator has one role only, and that is to be absolutely objective in how they draw out comments related to stakeholder stories and their fundamental interests. That facilitator must also be an expert, if you will, on something we just reviewed called active listening. That means that as people comment on the issue from their perspective, that facilitator must actively listen and ask clarifying questions, paraphrase each person's comment until everyone is satisfied that the comment that the individual made was in fact what they meant to be made. And that is actually then written for all to see on a blackboard. And this is very important because it means you are inviting the individuals to be forthcoming, and you are acknowledging the importance of the issue to them. And as we know from active listening, people have a great need to be understood, even more than to be agreed with. Now, there are guidelines that the facilitator will set out before each session, and those are ones that you may have expected. Number one, there must be a positive environment, meaning this is not an adversarial, argumentative process. In fact, each person who is providing their story and their fundamental interests cannot be interrupted by anyone else unless and until they are recognized by the facilitator. And then it is never to disagree with the other individual, but rather to ask clarifying questions in order to have a greater understanding of that individual's contribution. So with that, you can see that we've now gone through, and what may take several hours, several days, several months, depending on the severity and importance of the issue or conflict. But this is the process regardless of how long it takes. We've gone through storytelling, and we've now established the fundamental values of each stakeholder to the issue. The last section is reserved for providing options. In other words, searching for possible solutions that would meet and accommodate the fundamental interest brought forth from previous discussions of each of the stakeholders. And then as a group, having everyone or anyone who wishes to provide any possible solution to the situation. So in other words, let's go back to Mary, for example. Mary herself might offer a solution that says, well, let's have the meeting at 10 o'clock, because that'll give me a lot of time and I can get my kid all settled and I can be there and relax and contribute more. However, what Mary probably isn't thinking about in that comment is that while that 10 o'clock postponement may work well for her, how well is that likely to work for the other person who was a non-morning person? When you're a non-morning person, I don't know, is 10 o'clock not morning? So we have that whole idea that what may work for one individual, it's got to work for everybody. Because in this process, it's not about majority rules. This process is not considered complete until each and every stakeholder agrees that their fundamental interests have been satisfied and they will go along with an option that everyone can agree to. So in a sense, everyone has a kind of a veto. This is not about majority rule, but it's also not compromising, and it's also not winning and losing. So this is clearly a win-win if you want to talk about it in terms of a contest. I'd rather talk about it in simply a process to search for acceptable solutions. And this is really brainstorming. This is a place where you just go for it. You've got an idea, put it up on a board. The more the better. The only advice that is given by the facilitator is to keep in mind that as they propose possible options and solutions, that they keep in mind that solution ought to accommodate each and every stakeholder. So having heard the stories and the values of each of the stakeholders, that allows each of us who present ideas for a solution to kind of recall and take in what was the story and the value of every other player besides myself. So that really eliminates a lot of traditional bargaining and position holding and adversarial interactions, if you think about it that way. So in fact, it becomes a joint search for solutions and a highly positive relationship building process as well. Now, again, we would go through that third process, list 6, 10, 8, 20 possibilities. Each person who recommended a possibility would then go on to explain how they felt that that solution would accommodate all of the stakeholders' fundamental interests, so that each stakeholder is likely to support that as a solution. And this can go on for quite a while, and the facilitator is always asking for more. There may be ideas that hadn't been thought about. So what appeared to be an unsolvable issue all of a sudden becomes more solvable. Sometimes it's technology. Many people to this caricature situation, the hypothetical 8 o'clock meeting, bring in the idea of technology. Meetings don't have to necessarily be at a table in a concrete building. Today especially, with our new generation of millennials, everything's about social media, everything's about being online and connected. So we can connect for meetings, we can get input in lots of other ways than having a time slot at a physical building. Now, once the group does agree, if they in fact can, because if they can't agree, then you have no solution. But if the group mutually agrees to a particular solution or combination of possibilities, then the facilitator is left with 2 or 3 major questions that they must test the solution against. They have to have some criteria for acceptability, and that is, 1, is that solution legal? You can come up with all kinds of solutions, hypothetically, but 1, they must be legal, in fact. 2, they must be feasible. They must be able to be put into process, given the resources that your organization has. Do you have the time? Do you have the money? Do you have the resources? And so on and so forth to implement that particular suggestion. And then finally, is it ethical? Is this something that we can all put on the cover of the New York Times or any other magazine that the public would see? Would we be able to say, yes, we believe in this. This is a very good way to move forward on this situation. So you've got the legal implications, the feasibility, and the ethics involved. Now, once that has been completed, if your solution passes that test, you've got an answer. And now the group can go forward with a very high degree of predictability that they have reached a mutually agreed upon solution to what may have looked at one point as actually unsolvable. And I may have gone in a very lengthy way, to which I may have to apologize to all of you, but that is an overview of a difficult but highly effective process for a new way of looking at conflict that arises in the workplace and the search for solutions in order to maximize the productivity of everyone in your organization. Doc Horowitz, from Spain to you, bringing on our next module, the search for solutions.